Hello, hello, hello. This is Carlo Ratti with Architecture Talk Tank. Today, I have one of my favorite writers, architecture writers, on the Talk Tank. Really exciting.
One of your favorite?
You are my favorite. So Niall Patrick Walsh. I was reading your writing when I was at school, still architecture school, when you were writing for ArchDaily. And yeah, really, really loved it. And I never thought that we'll meet, but here we go. So it's exciting.
It's good to know someone was reading.
Yeah, probably half of the world.
But yeah,
Do you
no,
want
it's
to tell us?
good to be here. Good to be on. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? And I know that you're not working for ArchDaily anymore, and that you're up to some new exciting ventures. And it would be great to talk a little bit about that as well, as it ties into research study and things like that, and really interesting findings. So
Sure.
tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So yeah, my name's Niall Patrick Walsh. I'm based here in Dublin, in Ireland, and I work full time as an architectural designer for BDP, Building Design Partnership. They're one of the largest design and engineering firms in Europe. So I work in their Dublin studio full time, and the everything else I kind of do with my time, whether that's ArchDaily or writing or some of the platforms we'll talk about, kind of takes place in the space around that. So I graduated from my master's just under 2 years ago from Belfast in Northern Ireland. And around that time, I was, as well as kind of working full time, I was writing for ArchDaily. So I wrote with them for 2 years, I think from 2018 to 2020. So wrote kind of several hundred pieces of work about a wide variety of topics, whether that was kind of day-to-day realities of practice and kind of new and emerging buildings, or the kind of latest work of firms, or looking at more systemic issues and kind of systemic aspects to the way that architecture connects with the world around us. And I left ArchDaily about 8 months ago to kind of develop some of these ideas on my own. So myself and a colleague started Bubble Futures platform, which is a kind of a research / competitions platform, all dedicated to ideas about the future of the built environment, and about trying to broaden the scope of the architect, and maybe broaden the role of the architect or architectural designer in the in how we tackle some of the issues that just as a society we face, whether that's climate change or overpopulation or discrimination. We argue very much that architects have a voice, or should have a voice, in these issues. So whether it's through putting out calls for ideas, or showcasing other people's work, or generating our own research, anything we do is geared towards that, about kind of broadening the brief of the architect. So we're still operating that. We just concluded our latest competition called Accelerate the City, which is looking about how architecture can enhance resiliency and urban resiliency in cities, and how it can tackle issues in any city of people's choice. So that's kind of where I find myself at the moment, between BDP and between these kind of, you might call, extracurricular things outside of practice.
That's interesting. Actually, I'm quite curious to know why specifically competitions.
Mm-hmm. So we find that a central part of our role is to try and connect people, to try to almost form this kind of decentralized network of designers across the world, and try to uncover designers across the world that share our kind of views and ethos on what architecture could be. And competitions have always been, and particularly ideas competitions have always been, when they're used correctly, can be a brilliant vehicle for unearthing ideas that people not related by geography or anything else, but just decentralized groups of people across the world, what kind of ideas they can come up with, and to showcase the sheer breadth of ideas which are out there. I mean, what sometimes frustrates me about competitions is to see an ideas competition, which almost the brief is almost written, and it's design a tree house or design a museum or design something like that. But we tend to come at it from an issues point of view. So rather than asking designers or architects to design a particular structure, we ask them to focus on an issue. So to begin with, that was actually loneliness and isolation. We put out a very general call to designers and said, put forward the argument that isolation and loneliness is a systemic issue across the world, and ask a simple question: what can architects do? What can anyone interested in space, whether that's digital or physical, what can they do to address this? And simply for the second competition, rather than even identifying an issue or a site, what we actually did was create a 3-step process. So we said, number one, pick an issue. Number one, pick a city, any city around the world. Most people pick the city that they were living in, which is fine. Number two, pick an issue, which is fundamental to that city. And number three, create an urban future which seeks to address that issue. So we're not even too caught up on the idea of actually enacting any results or anything. It's not a project competition, it's an ideas competition. It's all about trying to propagate a position that architects, not only should architects have more to offer than what they sometimes do, just in the general kind of discourse and where we're going as a society, or even as a species, that we actually do engage with these issues. And there are designers and architects out there that we're not just kind of saying this on our own. There's a whole global community of architects out there who see beyond the day-to-day and see opportunities beyond that. So we found the competitions is a good vehicle it's an infrastructure already in place to connect those dots.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I love it. And I'm sure that because you mentioned to me before that the main concept is to look into the future, architecture of the futures, and also engage architects more with the future looking thinking about design, as well as their engagement in the processes. Yeah. So I think it's just a great tool to unite everybody around that topic. So tell me a little bit more about the research that you're doing with Bubble.
Sure. So the competition that we just ran, the Accelerate the City. So the premise behind this was that when you look at the world around you, almost every industry we're seeing an acceleration, whether it's in quality, whether it's in the time it takes to produce a product, or how responsive that product is to certain changes, or how it dictates trends. So we see this in communication, like what we're doing right now, advances in communication, advances in transport, even food, clothing. Almost every industry goes through a constant revision in response to needs and desires of people, and increasingly of the environment. And architecture often gets caught in a kind of a loop where, even though we are and can be a forward-thinking, kind of think outside the box profession, we're too often caught within maybe one of the most conservative industries in the economy, which is construction or real estate or property. So the premise of our research so far has been to put forward the idea that we can kind of move beyond this, that architecture could, say, speed up, to put it simply, hence Accelerate the City, that actually, rather than designing an architecture simply of its time, a static object in response to present needs, or simply in response to a market, that actually architecture could either become more fluid, more responsive, more alive, or it could become more resilient, almost more immovable, and stand the test of time. That the way the market is at the moment, we're in this kind of strange middle ground. And so that was the subject of the competition at the moment. So we've just concluded that. So our next step is we're putting together an ebook. So we've already collected all the ideas. We've published them on our website, bubblefutures.com. So our next step is to propagate these ideas. So for the For the last competition, we ran Eliminate Loneliness Through Design. That was through putting out press releases. It got published on a few different websites, and also putting together an ebook, which we sent across to architecture schools and to various organisations in the UK that are deal with mental health or isolation or loneliness, and trying to put it into an accessible format to get others to think outside the box. So at the moment we're talking about how we can do this with the latest competition, which is kind of a different challenge. We know there will be some kind of e-publication, ebook element to it, but the sheer wealth and variety of responses that we got, simply because of how open our brief was, has kind of made us step back and think, and we're trying to find other opportunities, and maybe trying to use try to use media and new media more proactively rather than simply an e-publication. So again, whether that's through interviews like what we're doing right now, or whether it's through getting back in touch with the designers who sent us the work and try to develop some of these ideas further with them, whether it's pitching it to design festivals. We actually were just recently, we were in Belfast Design Week up here. We had an exhibition there. So it could be engaging more with these kind of platforms. So we're still, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, Bubble is still quite young. We're only about a year old, so we're in some ways still finding our feet. But so yeah, so we see our role as to continue asking these questions to designers, and then to take on the responsibility of trying to spread the results and spread their ideas to people that we think need to hear them, whether that's within the architecture profession or outside it.
Interesting. And you just mentioned the architecture profession, which is really leading me to the second question. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your findings and insight into the future of architecture profession. I know that it's also a topic that you cover, and it's something that we decided to talk about mostly in this talk today. And I believe that Bubble Art Futures is basically a great platform for research into that topic. So tell us a little bit more about your findings so far.
Yeah, well, we findings about Bubble, or my kind of general reflections on the future. Yeah, sure. I mean, it's quite interesting for me to look at these things, because I'm still fairly early on in my career. I'm 26, so I've just come out of my master's, and I'm going into my my final, say, professional diploma. And over time, whether it's through working with ArchDaily or just general discussions in the masters, it's almost become rather poignant to watch how, when you begin a degree in architecture, you tend to have these very broad and very altruistic and very ambitious views on what the design of the built environment could entail. And as you progress through your education, it seems as though you're increasingly being steered towards a very, very defined and, I think, rather conservative view of what an architect does in their day-to-day life, to the extent that when you get to where I am at the moment, your kind of final professional diplomas, you can call yourself an architect. You are overtly being trained to kind of slot into a predetermined role in the real estate market or in the property market, where there's I think very little room for innovation, very little incentive maybe for innovation. When it speaks to a broader anomaly that our entire economic system, particularly in the West, but probably globally, when you center your economic system around growth and continuous growth, and the need to continue increasing profits and to increasing share prices, etc., you tend to get sucked into a kind of a status quo. And particularly in the property market is almost seen as a bellwether as to how an economy is performing. So architects have rather found themselves in this position where our role is almost responding to the kind of speculations of a developer or a hedge fund, or even domestic clients. And when you look at the education that we went through and the sheer volume of ideas and sectors and disciplines that we engaged with, actually, I think someone who put this very well was Liam Young, spoke to at ArchDaily, I think it was over a year ago. And the way he described it was that when you graduate from an architecture degree, if you walk into a bar, you could feasibly hold an in-depth conversation with a philosopher or an economist or an engineer or an artist or a novelist or a politician. As an architect, you're trained to see the world in such broad terms and to make all these connections that other more specialized industries don't have the room or simply just don't have the time or the role to look at, and that there's a dichotomy there between what we are capable of and what we actually do. So I think that I always have two thoughts on the future of architecture. One is that there's a massive untapped resource that we don't engage with, and that even I was quite lucky going through my master's degree that I was in a particular studio that did push for architecture to look more at global flows of food or energy or water, to try and understand how urbanism and architecture connects with the kind of processes that makes up the modern world. I think there's a tremendous untapped resource, mostly untapped resource for architects to engage with these issues, and again, step beyond the design of a medium-sized building. And the other concern I have, which is often floated, which is that we might have to do that anyway, because the role that we often find ourselves in is almost exactly the kind of role which is ripe for automation. I mean, if you look at the day-to-day workings of an architect, it is almost about trying to merge constraints and to kind of satisfy constraints and inputs and outputs. So, I mean, for example, you have a site that someone wants to put say a mixed-use scheme, apartments, retail, whatever. Quite often the reality of practice is feeding in constraints about topographies, constraints about user numbers, and inputting figures about how many apartments you want, space sizes for apartment, distances of corridors and widths of corridors. It would be astounding, given the rate of technological change, if within the next decade or so there aren't algorithms and artificial intelligence which are able to do this for us. So then architects are caught in this kind of loop where we haven't evolved with the times. We've tried to maintain a role and almost resistant to new technology, when it ironically could be a future where the only thing that actually saves us is how low our fees tend to be. But so I think that particularly for younger architects, I think there's both an opportunity, but maybe also a necessity to start to reposition ourselves within the market, and as other industries have done, to think about how we could be useful in not only responding to human needs in the next decade or even in the next century, but also responding to technological needs, to sustainable, to needs of the environment. And yeah, it will require a tremendous shift in how we educate architects and how architecture is discussed, the kind of the kind of day-to-day issues and processes that we occupy ourselves with. One person I think who does this very well is actually Neri Oxman. There was she gave a talk, was a talk or on her Netflix series, talked about how in the future architects would be alchemists. And she talked about almost alchemists merging chemistry, biology, technology, sustainability, all these different disciplines almost into a melting pot, and just seeing what we can create. And it's very much championing this idea of original thinking. And I mean, we see it. I mean, some of the most successful people in the world champion this. I mean, take the two richest people in the world, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They actually both they occupy themselves mostly with very different sectors. But their philosophy is very similar. Elon Musk calls it first principle thinking, and I think Jeff Bezos calls it step one thinking. But it's this idea that when you're given a task, rather than simply replicating what has come before you in the years before you, or replicating existing processes, you take a step back and you constantly examine and you constantly critique and you think, is this the best way to do this? Is this the best way to solve this problem? And I think architects, by the nature of our education, are set up for that realm of thinking. But too often we find ourselves trapped in the latter, which is a a simple repetition of what has come before us. I think that mostly defines a lot of what architects do today. So I think that for the future, I think the future is positive if we embrace and we are brave enough to broaden our to broaden our day-to-day preoccupations as professionals, and to, even if that means totally realigning ourselves in what we actually do and who we work for day to day.
I love you saying that, because really it's sort of like the driving force behind all my work. And I know you know that because we had loads of conversations about it. For those of you guys who are listening, and if you haven't yet listened to my new podcast, I talk about that in the new podcast, which is called Profitable Architect Online. Shameless plug, sorry. But the point is that actually it's really, to me, it's almost tying into the concept of business of expertise, which we see emerging more and more in so many different industries right now, especially in business, but also marketing and self-help and a lot of other things. It's really when the expert sort of creates a personal brand and goes really into helping others and providing value through whatever their level of expertise is in their area. And it's through info product, essentially. It's just an info product industry. So it's either researching that topic, providing a lot of value, but also coaching and training on that topic. And it's proven to be an extremely successful model. And I think the reason for that is that the world out there is oversaturated with sort of monothematic disciplines, and it's no longer enough to be yet another architect in the sea of 17,000 architects around the world, because that defines us merely by, yes, we provide design services, we can build your house, and what makes us different from one to another, it's not defined. And I think that more and more people, especially with the overload of information, with the technology, with possibilities, it's more valuable to us to connect on a level of what you're really passionate about and what is your expertise. And that expertise doesn't come just from experience, but also what was the research that you just deep dived into, knowing completely nothing about where would that take you. Maybe you did it for your master thesis to pass the exam, but then became obsessed, right, about it, and wrote a book or some extensive research. And those are those moments where we really find what triggers us and what interests us. And unfortunately, on the traditional path, a lot of times we just drop it and then go into a new role. Okay, now I'm a technical drafter or whatever at an architecture practice, and you drop what you really loved and what you were interested in a way. Sometimes we manage to integrate that through our designs or through our research or writing or whatever it is. But point being is that I think the industry altogether still doesn't cultivate basically that uniqueness which we all have inside, which makes us different by default. And quite honestly, there isn't a single other person that's had the same journey to becoming an architect and to realizing, what that actually means, what architecture means and what being an architect means in the whole world. And I think that when we see all these different cross-disciplinary architects that are doing incredible things, like Rachel Armstrong has had a huge, tremendous influence on my life. She's literally an architect, microbiologist who works in a lab, and she's developing this sort of how do you call it? The primary, a cell structure when it's just one cell, like amoebas or bacteria. Exactly. And she works with algae to basically save Venice. And it's incredible because it's working with an organism that is alive to create a building material which over time solidifies and has a potential to basically save a city from sinking. And that is architecture to me, 100%. But also it's so many other things. It's definitely philosophical, it's future looking, it's microbiology, it's lab work, it's so many different things. And I think that architecture really has the potential to go so deep into so many other industries and disciplines, just because it draws inspiration, but it also needs those elements. It's kind of constructed by all these different elements, and that gives me personally a lot of hope, because I think that in the reality that we live in today, it's quite normal to develop new basically new titles of a job. Like you can basically work and make money nowadays by your expertise, and you can say, you know, you don't even have to like use this traditional naming system for your career.
Yeah.
So basically there's a lot of freedom available to us, and I think that sort of when we talk about the future of architecture, it's really about architects embracing more of their uniqueness and allowing themselves to step out of the traditional path of architecture and kind of blend in all those inspirations from the outside and seeing where that goes. And when you look at all these famous architects too, they were much more than just an architect. You know, there was an element of philosophy and art history and sociology and so many different things. And I think that, like you said, architecture cultivates that from the very beginning. But I think that we still feel quite uncomfortable about embracing it as practitioners.
I think we do. I mean, there's a few things in that. I mean, ironically, talking about algae and using algae growth to save flooding cities, there is actually literally a project on Bubble Futures platform that we detail that about kind of creating a seawall, almost like a living seawall that continues to grow in response to rising sea levels. But I think that no, I agree with everything you said. I think that a lot of our nervousness in practice are about practitioners embracing these kind of say these new definitions for what an architect could do. I think goes back to our education system, and I don't think. I mean, it's not unique to architecture. There's a very good TED talk by a man called Ken Robinson, and he advocates for a new education system. He argues that the current model for education is still a remnant from the Industrial Revolution, where children are effectively trained along factory lines and the goal of the education system isn't to bring out people's uniqueness. It's actually to almost robotically program them into replicas of each other to perform predetermined tasks to serve the interests of people above them. And I think that mostly still defines the education system, but I think it also defines the architectural education system. You know, as I said, the deeper into an architectural education you go, the more geared you are towards a very, very narrow vision of what you as a professional should concern yourself with. And again, quite often it's producing a structure or a building along relatively traditional lines to a predetermined brief, almost by a predetermined client. And I think that you kind of touched on this, that one of the strengths of the architect is this multidisciplinary ability that we have. And there was a time that I think it was either the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. There was a prominent theory about the kind of separation of industries and kind of separations of professions. That you have a defined, you have a legal profession and a medical profession and an engineering profession and an architectural profession, and that they have very, very predetermined and set roles, and that they combine to create to be larger than the sum of their parts. And to some extent, this also actually, I think, filtered through to urbanism. You often hear the idea of education districts and culture districts and food districts, etc. This kind of division of industry and almost division of use, which just isn't the way that the modern world works. I mean, we're living in one of the most interdependent, interdisciplinary worlds or times in human history. And the way that the architect is educated, it's almost as if I heard this line recently about that we learn the skills to learn new skills. if that makes sense. That we're very good at picking up any issue, any site, any context, and applying some kind of informative and evidence-based vision for what this could be in the future. And it goes back to one of the very first lines you hear in architecture school is problem solving, and that we're educated to be problem solvers. I think that's a good thing. But as you go through an architectural education, the nature of the problems that you think are yours to solve gets quite narrow, and they're sectioned off into a very definitive, a very definitive, and I think very small portion of the wider way in which the world works. And I think that for practitioners who've been through that education, it's understandably difficult to break away from that. Just the nature is, as we get older, we get more responsibilities. And I think that, I think a large part of any reform that would need to be for us to broaden our scope is to think about how we actually procure work. Because again, quite often, if we procure work entirely, say through the real estate market or the property market and by and large the private real estate market, which defines a lot of the market in which architects seek work from. That is not an industry which lends itself to innovation. Quite understandably, clients don't want their money to be, and it's not quite often not even their money. They don't want it to be used as a kind of a guinea pig for testing new ideas about how we might live in the future and how we might tackle climate change or overpopulation or lagging infrastructures. Quite often, they're in an industry driven solely by profit and solely by short-term growth, you're not going to see much risk being taken in those industries. So then we need to start thinking about whether we need to approach the institutions more, education institutions. You do see some. We referenced Neri Oxman earlier. She built a lot of her greatest achievements came from the MIT Media Lab. And I was thinking there was also Carlo Ratti in the MIT Senseable City Lab. There are some examples of the institutions taking that mantle of innovation, but even increasingly that is starting to be eroded by universities and colleges coming under pressure to operate as profit-driven industries and profit-driven businesses. And so something I often reflect on is how architecture is one of those disciplines that we don't seem to engage with angel investing. We don't seem to engage with venture capitalism. I wish that these larger issues didn't have to be left to the private market, but if you look at almost every other successful business or almost every other innovation, whether it's social media or whether it's technology or retail, quite often, or transportation or even Airbnb, quite often their genesis is in somebody with a vision pitching an idea and to a group of people who see potential, often very wealthy people who see potential and who are willing to fund it. And exactly. if the institutions aren't going to fund these ideas, and increasingly governments aren't going to fund these ideas, and there's no hope of us innovating in the real estate sector, maybe we do have to start doing what other leading industries are doing and speaking louder about our visions and ideas about how we can create a more sustainable, equal and stable world, and pitching these to startups and to people and individuals and organizations which actually lend themselves to innovation, rather than trying to hollow innovation out of a market that just doesn't lend itself to it.
Sounds like someone has to start a VC fund for architecture.
Yeah, I can't. I'm the furthest from a venture capitalist supporter you'll probably find, and yet it's difficult to see any of it. The only other hope you would have is for institutes such as the United Nations, the European Union, or even national governments. But increasingly, with the way that our political environment is going, it's increasingly difficult for governments to take risks on new ideas. An example was I think it was 2010 Barack Obama poured billions into a solar startup called Cylindra. They were trying to develop a new solar cell which would produce an unprecedented amount of power for, considering its size or considering its cost. The US government poured billions into it, and they were ultimately undercut by, I think, the Chinese government funded a rival, which were able to bring something to market which is much cheaper, and Cylindra almost went out of business. That was a political lightning rod for Barack Obama for the rest of his presidency. His political opposition would point to this one example and say, here's an example of how he was either accused of cronyism, or else he was accused of being this radical Marxist leftist who had this fairy tale vision of the future of energy, and that he can't be trusted with the economy, etc. It's increasingly more difficult for governments to actually fund innovation, and I think that's it's a dangerous. It puts us on dangerous ground, because we're only now waking up to the consequences of the way in which we have built our economic model, and to some extent the way we funded urbanization over the last 100 years. We've found a way, and even the way that we build and sell commodities, the goal is to make things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and more efficient, and we've almost entirely ignored the climate cost. And we're at a point now where the responses and the level of change we're going to need in order to reverse some of these trends is going to be massive, and it will require massive sums of money, massive investment, and massive visions. Almost, I mean, Elon Musk's vision of Mars is even one example. Radical solutions to very intricate problems. And to bring it back to architects, I think architects are one of few professions who are perfectly placed for that. But we find ourselves, I think, overall in the wrong market, and in a market that isn't, I think, going to contribute to those solutions. I actually think is mostly part of the problem. But yeah, to sum it up, I do think it starts with education. I think it starts with us. I think it starts with almost realigning student expectations of what their role should be in the industry when they graduate. And but until we do that, I think it will be very difficult to reverse.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really passionate about this topic because, one of the reasons why I live in Berlin, Germany, is because technology and startup is a really big component of the development of the city, especially if it comes to intellectual and innovation development. And what's really great is that I work as a mentor, business mentor mainly, and hardware mentor for a few startups here, startup accelerators actually in Berlin. So they're like incubator programs, mainly sponsored privately or by the EU or German government, where not students, really young people start startups under these programs. And it's really remarkable sometimes working with these people and seeing what kind of ideas they have and where they take them, and interacting with hands-on, really practical environments where young people develop businesses. It's totally acceptable and totally normal in this field, talking about moonshot ideas that, people like Richard Branson talks a lot about, and people that are like extremely successful business people. And you can, in your age of 26, start a startup, a tech startup or whatever in Berlin, where the scope of the business is bigger than big, quite literally. Yeah. And these people are encouraged because it has to do either with AI, with mobility, which German government puts a lot of money in. And I find it being so close to architecture that it's almost incredible that there is so much innovation supported by governments and the system altogether in the aspect of mobility, which obviously has to do with, with cars, planes, trains, anything to do with infrastructure. But not the built environment. And we really are somehow, like, as a whole industry, behind. And so that innovation is not supported like we are literally spending our days and our whole careers imagining big things. Like we work on these utopian ideas and all sorts of things, right? With urban scale and also architectural scale, which is big enough. And yet somehow there is nowhere in this, there is nobody quite important to listen to these ideas to somehow facilitate growth of few of them. And that's normally what happens in the tech world. I mean, big business people are literally fishing for young innovative ideas that they can put money into to see them grow. And that's how businesses like you mentioned, Airbnb and Uber and all these things, that's how they emerge. And they do start with a great vision but very little money or possibility. And then it's not just that it booms out of nowhere. It's not Zuckerberg's kind of claim to fame idea. In every single one of these startups, there is a lot of investments that back those ideas up. And when you start looking into statistics, which is something I do a lot right now, like when I'm interested in a business, I will look into the Series A and B funding, and just to realize that like Series A is mainly raising money just for the idea. So you come to someone and you say, well, this is my idea and here is some research to back it up, and that these companies can get 4 million for just developing an MVP, like before you even know if this is going to scale. It's remarkable. And this is basically the possibilities available in industries that are so close to architectural industry and yet somehow our industry and yes, it's education, but also there's something missing with the link between generally business development, business expansion. Where can we take those ideas? How can we better serve communities, not to just come up with utopian solutions, but actually truly implement them? And we don't hear many of these projects happening because they don't get the financial backup needed. And I think that also obstructs our research and how far we can go with research, because if there is not enough money to develop that innovation or sponsor that innovation, then there's just so much we can go, like so far we can go as architects actually looking into innovation. And what is the solution? I mean, it's a huge problem. It has to do with politics, education, with the system, with institutions. But I think that one way in which I personally found a way to sort of go about it is to get interested in VC funding, get interested in technology, and see how you can combine the two to develop architectural ideas. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what an average startup does. Like they have an idea to do with in some way bettering someone else's life, and whether it's through an a phone app or a service that they provide that is computerized, somehow digitalized, and they go out there, do research, and then get into these accelerators to see whether or not they can bring it to VCs and fund these projects to develop. And if we only got interested in business a bit more than we are as architects, us individually, not blaming institutions, not trying to say the system is broken, but like actually, what can I do? And this is what I try to encourage everyone to do, is start reading business books, start looking at how the business industry develops, how the tech industry develops, and also mobility, I think, is a great example to look into. And how can a 25-year-old who has got an idea of building a train and a train business actually bring that idea to fruition? What is that process? And once you start studying those processes, you realize that you can actually bring a lot of architecture innovation to fruition following that traditional route that is, for example, practiced in technology, but not the traditional path of architecture. And so I think that this is where we ourselves have to kind of broaden our field of interest and start drawing inspiration from other models that are working. They prove to be working. They do bring success. They bring money. They are growing, but also there is a lot of help available out there for businesses like that.
And I agree. I agree with all of that. I mean, I do, yes, put a certain responsibility on the architect or on the designer to recognize these opportunities. But the reason I keep coming back to the education system is if you're going to be in this environment for 5 years, and for architects it's more like 7 years, if that environment isn't built to introduce you to these possibilities and to broaden your mind about what you could do for the future, what on earth is it for? Like, why? I mean, why pay thousands of pounds or dollars or euros worth of fees to be hamstrung into a unsustainable and relatively not useful area of society or of the economy? I think there is a certain onus on the institutions to put it to graduates and to students. And again, I think by sheer luck, I happened to meet groups of academics who did open us to these possibilities. That's the only reason I'm here talking about it. That's the only reason that we founded Bubble. That the opportunity is there for you to engage with these issues and to promote innovation. I mean, give one simple example is housing. I mean, if you look at a lot of the most successful startups, it often begins by identifying a problem and trying to go back to what Elon Musk would call first principles thinking to address those problems. I mean, the issue of housing is so central to what architects should be doing. Even the most mundane definition of an architect will involve themselves with housing. But the access to affordable, sustainable housing is probably one of the biggest issues that we face as humankind. I mean, if you were to pick one issue to innovate, for architects, I mean, housing is an open goal. It's almost as if architects aren't going to do it, who will? And quite often and I saw this quite a lot at ArchDaily, the preeminent solution seems to be, let's build almost the exact same model of housing, just 50% smaller, micro housing, tiny housing, etc. I mean, that's not a solution. That's, if anything, that creates, I mean, in particular, I think COVID has shown some of the mental health implications of just radically reducing the physical size of the space in which we live are probably drastic. And some people dismiss it as saying, oh, we need to build smaller houses because we're running out of space, which is insane. We're not. Cities themselves don't take up space. If anything's taking up space, it's mostly the food systems and in fact mostly the farming and the food systems used to support those cities. It's not related to the size of the spaces in which we live. But I mean, if you were to take that kind of response, the tiny, some people want to live in smaller houses, that's fair enough, go for it. But the putting forward the solution of the housing crisis as reducing the size of homes, that's not a first principles way of looking at things. That's very much looking at the way we did things yesterday and just making minor tweaks to it. If we really want to solve that issue, we have to go back to the fundamentals of how we build, what kind of materials we use, for what purpose are we building, and thinking about the nature of the things that we build. I mean, is it still the right approach to just build this kind of shelter that we populate ourselves? Does housing, whether it's apartments or larger houses, do they need to become more active or more responsive? Should the norm be, now that we're trying to develop housing which recycles its own water, which grows its own food, or which creates its own energy, which somehow measures the health of the people that live within it, that can grow or contract or can be built, I'd say built for 40% of the cost? There's all these deep questions around housing, which would be of major benefit not just to architects but to the world. I mean, imagine what it would do for the world if the cost of housing was able to decrease by, say, 50%. I mean, it would probably end homelessness overnight. I mean, imagine the human potential you would unlock if you were able to give, whether it's government or the institutions, where if you were able to at least give citizens the security of a dignified place to live. Imagine the human potential you would unlock from that. I mean, these are the kind of things that as architects we should be running through our mind. And again, I don't place the blame on architects. I place the blame on the system through which we are educated. And again, that's why I think any change in this system has to go back to that. Back to that system and back to just the principles and the positioning that we experience from academics. And it's not even to blame academics, because mostly the academics are responding to curriculum set by, say, in the UK it would be the RIBA. I mean, to a certain extent, universities are kind of hamstrung by what they can teach, because they have to maintain, they have certain criteria they have to hit with the RIBA and with professional institutions. But yeah, I mean, I again was, I think, lucky that I landed myself in a few of us did landed ourselves in a tutor group, and with a group of professors that did encourage us to think in broader terms like this. But that was, I mean, that was not only that was very much the minority position, even within our university cohort, whereas I think it should be the majority position. And so I think that if as a body or as a profession we want to reform the way in which we work, I think we need to start with education.
Absolutely. And it's just something that it's not really about blaming the system, but we have to also understand that the system is there to support one goal. It was basically created so that we get chartered, so that we don't go out there building buildings that are not legally formed and basically don't obey certain legal rules. And there is a purpose behind all of this, and I understand. But if we go around as architects basically calculating our worth only dependent on whether or not you've got already qualified and you have that RIBA Part 3 or this and that chartered hood, and you've been put on the list of these architects, and then go around and say, to people that maybe didn't do that because they chose an alternative career in architecture, that they're somehow a failure because they didn't comply with that system, then we're literally running around in circles, completely missing out the point of what's going on. And what's going on is that this system, there is an absolute purpose behind why it exists, but you don't have to just follow that and play by the book with everything. Well, you can you can do that, but the point is that there's a lot of other ways in which you can serve and help, and there is a need for that innovation. And so by all means, we cannot limit anyone who's trying to innovate or help or bring value with their background in architecture, but maybe choosing a different alternative route to achieve the results or to help. And we cannot just mark that as failure. And I find that to be a big problem in the industry, is that I understand it takes us so much energy to get educated in the system. It's 7 years of this, it's so much pressure and stress and everything that we have to go through, that of course we value very much that piece of paper that they give us at the end if we pass it. But we cannot say that this is the only thing that makes you an architect, and that it's the only thing that basically you need to practice architecture. Because I myself learned under architects that have been building incredible buildings, and actually by education were anthropologists, moved to a country where they can serve and started to build incredible, beautiful structures, which are fully blown buildings. And they do get permits and everything, but they have never went to architecture school. What do you say to that? If you're judging on people that are doing this just because they didn't go down the traditional architecture path, then something's wrong with your understanding of how you can serve the world, I believe. And I think that this is really somehow where we have to confront ourselves and our own values to understand, like, okay, well, even if you chose a traditional way, which I've got nothing against, it's like, if it's serving you, that's fine. But I think that there is a lot of gaps that system is not serving, like all these things we mentioned in this talk, and that there is a really important need for people to step up their game and somehow start facing those gaps. And that's what innovation means. And a lot of times it means that you have to come out of your comfortable seat and put a different hat on and become someone you're not trained to be in order to actually bring that innovation forward. And this kind of ties back into our personal understanding what it means to be an architect, I guess, and our personal reason why we would drive that innovation. And do we stay in the traditional path or do we innovate? That's also a question here.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, honestly, I see no reason why we can't do both. I mean, I think that there's much more room for us to innovate. I don't think that needs to come at the expense of architects and designers fulfilling the role they already do. I mean, if you get a tremendous satisfaction or worth out of shaping people's environments, even in the most traditional way as we do at the moment, I have no problem with that. And I think that's a valuable use of time for people who are good at it. The critique I come at is that that is one option for that is one outcome from the set of skills and the set of ideas which we're exposed to in the university or education system, but it's not the only application of those skills. And I think too often it's taken as granted, or it's presented as granted by the institutions, that this is the only application of your skills. But I do. Yeah, I totally see the value in being educated on building regulations about fire safety, and that does form an integral part to profession, and that is part of the reason why architect the title architect is a protected title, because you can't gain that title without showing a competency in regulations and understanding and incorporating user safety into structures. But this is probably a separate conversation, but it goes back to what I then mentioned at the start. Those are, to me, that falls into the constraints category. There's a particular set of parameters you have to abide by in order to make buildings safe and habitable and occupiable and structurally sound. That if you look at the rate of change and the rate of advancement in artificial intelligence, where you already have systems which are able to, who almost a decade ago were at chess, were beating some of the greatest chess grandmasters, and now is it AlphaGo, or that it's regarded as one of the most complex games in the world. It has millions of different moves you can make, that an AI system was able to beat the world champion at that. That's actually, it sounds totally different, but it's the same application. It's applying a set of rules and constraints onto a condition of certain parameters. That can apply to the architecture industry as much as it applies to anything else. And I think there's a danger of, or if you're talking to if I'm talking to the traditional architect, I think it is a danger that a lot of the role which they a lot of the role which is currently dependent on for architects in the design and construction of buildings could be automated in decades, maybe even in years, who knows. But it's certainly, we're nowhere near immune to it. There's often an argument that I hear that because architecture has its basis in the arts, that it's somehow more it's more future-proof. If we did have our basis in the arts, we might be more future-proof, but the day-to-day reality of architecture isn't even based in the arts. It's based mostly in regulation, in finance and profit, and trying to attain a certain amount of figures, whether that's spatial figures or occupancy figures or financial figures, trying to overlay them onto a given parameter, which is often usually a building site, to certain constraints. That is the language of automation. Again, it's probably a different discussion for another day, but it also adds to this layer of future-proofing the profession, and trying to expand our role in a world where AI is increasingly consuming some of the traditional roles that we used to occupy.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Not at all. Thank you.
We went for almost an hour, but I think it's one of the most insightful talks that I had on this channel. So it's really.
I thought it was half an hour, so I only had one coffee lined up. I should have had 2 or 3.
Sorry. I can't help it. I just get so sucked into these conversations.
They're important. They're important conversations. They are increasingly being had. And the one thing that does make me actually optimistic is that I talk about, because I think I've sounded probably quite negative throughout this whole thing, but one of the sources of optimism I often found that at ArchDaily was that if I particularly in the last kind of year that I was writing there, I had a lot of editorial freedom. I could define my own topics, and I often found that the more abstract and the more kind of at the surface unrelated to architecture, traditional architecture, a topic was, the more popular it was. I wrote articles about the food industry, about mining, as in mining raw materials. That the more I started to connect architecture with the global flows that make up the modern world, the more engaged the readership was. So I actually find a lot of optimism and cause for hope in that. That I think that we do still harbor an interest in the future and in how all these at first separate industries and separate sectors do actually merge, and they quite often still merge in, and will probably still continue to merge in, the built environment, in urbanism and in cities, and ultimately in architecture. So I do have these conversations they do find ears, and I think there is a hunger for them. So I think it's good that people like yourself are hosting them.
Thank you. Absolutely. I love having these conversations, and I really hope that it can facilitate a really good place also for thinking differently. And, it's definitely early days, but I'm looking forward to see what happens out of this, with this community, and also following the careers of the people that are coming onto this platform as well, because practically everyone's changing the world of architecture in their own unique way. And sometimes it receives criticism, but there is nothing wrong in being different. And this is basically the message I'm trying to cultivate here. And I really hope that everyone, in one way or another, can allow to absorb that message somehow, because it's not to criticize the architects that have been really indoctrinated in that traditional path. I just think that learning from other people and learning from other models and being innovative, even if you end up franchising your architecture business, which is kind of unusual, but even if you do that, it's not to say that that's not architecture anymore. It is. It's just not how you do it.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say, by means of people who are thinking about this more, is one of the most enjoyable things I did that I've done in the past, I think, couple of years, is I interviewed Richard Saul Wurman. He's the founder of he founded TED Talks, so the TED conference. He created that. And he's an architect. He trained as an architect. He was best friends with Louis Kahn. I think his mentor was actually Charles Eames, and he studied architecture back in, I think, the 1930s. I think he's in his 80s now. He lives in Florida, and he studied architecture, spent his early years in architecture, and then departed to explore a whole host of adjacent industries, whether it was cartography and map making. I think he was the first person to map a lost Inca city or it could have been a Mayan city in Mexico. Someone can correct me on that. But and you can read more about him. He eventually reinvented the guidebook, the city guidebook, and then he founded the TED conference, and then he founded TED Med, a medical version of it. And I asked him, how a training and how your path diverted from architecture towards these fields, and what he actually said was he hasn't left architecture, that architecture is in everything, and that architecture still his study of architecture still is the genesis of everything he's achieved. I always hold him up as an example of, he has changed. He'd never admit it. He has changed the world by founding TED, and the sheer millions and millions of people who've watched that and who've gained inspiration from it. There's no limit to what architects can do with the skills they acquire. And he was quite clear. The interviews on ArchDaily, he was quite clear. He would not have done what he had done if he had not studied architecture and he had not engaged with architectural ideas. So yeah, there's absolutely no limit on what architecture adjacent or architectural designers can do with their and the effect they can have. And it does go far. It includes the design of traditional building design, but it goes far beyond that as well.
Absolutely. Honestly, I feel so inspired, and this is really why I'm doing this talks, because I love these conversations and they inspire me so much. So thank you so much for joining today. Really great conversation, and I really hope we can do it again sometime. Maybe talk about
Sure.
writing, which is a huge part of your life.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks so much for this full hour of a great, great, valuable input.
Not at all. Thank
you.
Awesome.
And
Thank you.
also thank you guys for tuning in. For more of this, just subscribe to YouTube.
Great.
Sarah
Thanks, Sarah.
Coletta. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.